Shalom, and welcome to Introduction to the Apostolic Writings. This is a class for Messianic Jewish Theological Institute, and this is video number 2. I'm Derek Lehman. You can find me at dereklehman.com. That's DEREKLEMAN.com. Now the question we're asking in this segment is, why the New Testament? And in the writings that we call the New Testament, or the Apostolic Writings, there are a few places that say something about the purpose of one of the writings. Most famously, we have in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 31, this saying, "Yet these were written so that you would believe that Yeshua is the Mashiach, the Son of God, and so that in your faith you would have life in His name." The Apostolic Writings, or the New Testament, consist of 27 different documents. In the New Testament we have 4 lives of Yeshua, 1 history of the early years of the Yeshua movement, 13 letters of Paul, 8 other general letters by apostles, and 1 apocalypse. But the question is, why were these documents written in the first place? And why were they gathered by later generations into a collection? So often people assume that because a book is on the shelf today called the Bible or the New Testament, that it was meant from the beginning to be gathered that way. What caused these 27 documents not only to be written, but to be gathered, collected, and read by generations in the Yeshua movement, which became Christianity? And why do they matter today? David De Silva, in his book, An Introduction to the New Testament, says this. He says, "Each text was written to serve some specific pastoral needs and answer a range of important questions arising out of the life of the early church." And let me list for you in bullet points what some of those needs and issues were. Let's think about the situation of the Yeshua movement at the time that the New Testament was written. And every one of these bullet points, what I'm going to say, is something very important if you'll think about it, but I'm going to say them very briefly. The people of the Roman Empire were coming into a faith that had Jewish roots. People who are used to pagan temple worship, which was very individualistic, were for the first time living in a community as directed by Yeshua and the apostles, a very different way of life than they had known in paganism. Community, the idea of gathering together week after week and having to have ongoing relationships with people, was not normally a part of Greco-Roman religion. And people who are used to myths and legends and mysteries were now following a belief that involved a historical Messiah, a figure of history. Jewish disciples now had a new Torah teacher as well as a Messiah. The eyewitnesses of Yeshua's resurrection, teaching, and miracles were dying out. And as the last eyewitnesses and apostles were on the earth, people began to worry about what would happen next in the movement. The death of Yeshua as a criminal was a scandal for people in this new faith throughout the Roman Empire. Non-Jews were told by the synagogues that only Jews are kosher to God, and so they had to convert if they wanted to be kosher to God. This was a popular message. The temple was at a certain point destroyed in the history of the early movement, and that put Judaism in a crisis. And the future promises of God needed to be clarified. This is something that affected believers in Yeshua all over the Roman Empire because the roots of the gospel were Jewish, and if the temple was destroyed, what would this mean for the Yeshua movement? The promises of what Messiah would do were unfulfilled. And as the eyewitnesses and apostles died out, people feared that they had missed the second coming. Another issue is that teachers were rising up everywhere and claiming authority. How do you know who to believe? How do you know what information was good, what was genuine, and from the apostles? The Roman authorities were growing more hostile toward the Yeshua communities. And finally, people wondered about their relatives and friends who were not in Messiah. What did that mean? And so the New Testament was written to address these kinds of pastoral issues and needs in the early Yeshua community. The purpose of the 4 lives of Yeshua, the Gospels as we call them, is very interesting to think about. Except for Mark, which may have been written very early, the Gospels were written as the last eyewitnesses of the life of Yeshua were dying, as that generation was passing away, and there was concern that these things would be forgotten. Now, in the early days, the Yeshua community told the stories of the death and the resurrection and the life and the miracles and the teachings of Yeshua orally. Eyewitnesses were well known in Israel and in Syria and in Asia Minor. Eyewitnesses of the things that Yeshua had done and said. And eyewitness stories were told in public meetings. And people who heard eyewitnesses would also retell the stories secondhand, quoting the eyewitnesses that they had heard them from. And then the stories were told third hand, and it was passed down in a chain and from place to place. It was important for people to be able to trace the stories originally back to people who had actually experienced them. And so we see traces of these eyewitnesses in the way names are used in the Gospels. That's what Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is all about. And the eyewitnesses who are named in the Gospels repeatedly include Peter and Jairus and Simon of Cyrene and Mary Magdalene and James the brother of Yeshua, Lazarus of Bethany, Mary of Bethany, the beloved disciple who is unnamed, Joanna, Susanna, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and more. But after the temple was destroyed, and as the oldest disciples and eyewitnesses were disappearing, it became very important to start writing these things down. And some took up the challenge of writing Greek-style biographies. Now, Mark was written before the temple was destroyed, but also possibly there was a concern that the eyewitnesses were dying out, or that the stories needed to not just be told orally, they needed to be written. And they collected in these four Gospels some of the traditions, but not by any means all of them. And they often indicated their original eyewitnesses by naming them in the accounts. And they accepted that it might be generations before Yeshua would return and fulfill the rest of the promises of his messiahship. So they knew it needed to be written down and passed on to future generations. The first documents to be written in what we now call the New Testament, or the Apostolic Writings, were the letters. Now, you could get confused because when you look in the New Testament, the Gospels are first, and you might think they were written first. But with the exception of the Gospel of Mark, that's not the case. The letters were written first. Mark is the only Gospel that was written early enough, perhaps during the time that Paul was writing his letters. But otherwise, the Gospels, or the lives of Yeshua, are later than the letters. Now, the early letters, and probably the earliest is Galatians, address some very pressing problems. And the chief problem addressed by the book of Galatians is this. Synagogue leaders were telling non-Jewish followers of Yeshua that they needed to be circumcised in order to be kosher to God. So, Paul wrote a letter showing thoroughly that Gentiles had always been included in the promises given to Abraham, and that circumcision and Jewish identity came after the Abrahamic promise. And therefore that faith, not Jewish identity as marked by certain Torah commands, had always been what God accepted. And therefore Gentiles could be children of Abraham the same way as Jewish people, by faith. As the Yeshua community spread all over the Roman Empire, Luke wrote Acts to say to the far-flung Christians who are a long way from Jerusalem, a long way from the start of the Yeshua movement, that the gospel came from Jerusalem and was authentically passed down from the people who had seen the risen Messiah. And as hostility from Rome increased, believers found themselves outcast now from the Jewish and the Roman worlds. They were people without a home. Synagogues began excluding Christians. In Roman festivals, the refusal of Christians to offer sacrifices to the Caesar or to the images put them in danger. It marked them out as different, people who didn't go along with the rest of society. Romans began calling Christians atheists, non-believers in the gods and in the divine power of Caesar. And their watchword was Yeshua is Lord, but the Romans' watchword was Caesar is Lord. And so the Apocalypse, or the book of Revelation, was written. Rome was called Babylon in the Apocalypse, And it was ruled secretly, according to the Apocalypse, by the dragon, Satan. Israel's place was secure, but in Messiah, and not in the power of the synagogues. And a countless multitude of people from the nations, a countless multitude of Gentiles, would be saved. Roman power, according to the Apocalypse, was an illusion. The real power was in heaven, and Messiah would come in his time to set everything right. So the writings we call the New Testament, or the Apostolic Writings, are not philosophy, and they're not simply theology either. They address real life issues. They're answers and help for living by faith in Yeshua in a world that is mostly hostile to that faith. I'm Derek Lehman, and this is Introduction to the Apostolic Writings.